The lights were blinding. The cameras rolled. And the nation held its breath. This wasn't just another political event. It wasn't another panel filled with rehearsed lines and polite disagreements. No, this was a collision course between two powerful forces with very different visions of justice, power, and public service. On one side stood Pam Bondi, the former Florida Attorney General, polished, seasoned, and no stranger to controversy. On the other, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a rising star from Texas known for her razor-sharp intellect, fierce advocacy, and unshakable moral compass. The tension between them had been building for weeks, and now it was about to erupt, live on stage, in front of the entire country. As Bondi approached the microphone, the atmosphere in the room shifted. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence alone commanded attention. With a measured smile, she launched into what many assumed would be standard critique, until it turned personal. Very personal. Frankly, Bondi began, her voice laced with condescension, I don't believe Congresswoman Crockett is qualified to speak on judicial reform. Her record lacks the depth, the integrity, and quite frankly, the credibility this panel demands. Gasps. Audible gasps. Crockett sat just a few feet away, her expression unreadable. But the insult had landed. Bondi's words weren't just professional critique. They were calculated character assassination. And it wasn't just about qualifications. It was about identity, experience, and who gets to define credibility in the halls of power. Social media exploded within minutes. Clips of the comment were already circulating before the panel had moved to its second speaker. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't interrupt. She didn't shake her head or roll her eyes. She waited. She listened. And then, when her time came, she stood. No papers. No notes. Just fire. I appreciate your concern, MS. Bondi, she said, her voice steady and low. But let's talk about qualifications. In that instant, the room froze. Because anyone who had ever doubted Crockett was about to learn exactly why that was a mistake. She began with her credentials. A law degree, years as a public defender, her relentless advocacy for criminal justice reform in Texas, and now, her voice in Congress fighting for transparency and accountability. But Crockett didn't stop there. She turned the mirror back on Bondi, highlighting her own record. The dropped investigation into Trump University, the cozy relationships with corporate donors, the legal decisions that raised eyebrows across Florida. If qualifications mean serving the public without fear or favor, she said, then maybe we need to redefine what experience actually means. The crowd erupted, not with chaos, but with something far more powerful, recognition. Because this wasn't just about a panel, or even about Jasmine Crockett and Pam Bondi. This was about every woman who's ever been told she's too loud, too emotional, too inexperienced. It was about Black women who are expected to work twice as hard for half the respect. And it was about a system that still, far too often, confuses privilege for merit. By the time Crockett finished her opening remarks, the narrative had flipped entirely. The woman who had been called unqualified had just schooled the room in how to lead, with facts, with dignity, and with unshakable presence. And this was only the beginning. The silence after Jasmine Crockett's opening was electric, like the calm after a thunderclap. For a brief moment, even the cameras seemed to hesitate, unsure of whether to zoom in on Crockett's unwavering gaze or the flicker of discomfort on Pam Bondi's face. But the Congresswoman wasn't done, not by a long shot. She leaned slightly forward toward the microphone, her tone calm but unrelenting. You see, I didn't come here to exchange insults, she said, scanning the audience. But if we're going to talk about who's qualified to speak on justice, then let's tell the full story. And she did. Crockett began to unravel Bondi's record, not with petty jabs or emotional outrage, but with surgical precision. She referenced Bondi's controversial decision to halt an investigation into Trump University shortly after receiving campaign donations from the Trump Foundation. We're told that justice is blind, Crockett said. But when campaign checks come in the mail, it seems some eyes peek through the blindfold. There were murmurs, some skeptical, some approving, but everyone was listening now. She went on to contrast her own career path, fighting for indigent clients, standing up to police misconduct, sponsoring legislation for sentencing reform, with what she called Bondi's record of selective outrage. Crockett reminded the room that while Bondi often spoke of law and order, she had remained silent when unarmed Black men were killed on Florida soil. Where was this passion for justice then? She asked, letting the question hang in the air. But what set Crockett apart wasn't just the facts she presented, it was how she delivered them. She layered her argument with personal stories. The mother in Dallas who cried in her office because her teenage son was sent to adult prison over a nonviolent offense. The grandmother who couldn't afford bail and lost her home while waiting for her trial date. These weren't hypotheticals. These were names, faces, and futures impacted by a system that often felt rigged. She then pivoted seamlessly from critique to vision. Crockett spoke of the need for mandatory implicit bias training for judges, the elimination of for-profit detention centers, and national standards for police accountability. This isn't just policy, she said. This is about restoring trust in a system that has broken too many promises for too long. The room shifted again. Even those who had initially sided with Bondi were now leaning in, drawn to Crockett's clarity, her conviction, and the unmistakable sense that this wasn't theater. It was truth. Bondi, who had positioned herself as the expert in the room, now sat visibly rigid, her earlier confidence melting into defensive glances. In a calculated move, Bondi attempted a rebuttal. She stepped forward, invoking her years of service and high-profile prosecutions. But her words felt off-tempo, reactive rather than authoritative. And in contrast to Crockett's measured eloquence, Bondi's tone seemed brittle, even desperate. Crockett, unfazed, reclaimed the spotlight. "I'm not asking you to take my word for it," she told the audience. "I'm asking you to look at the work, at the communities I've stood with, at the reforms I've helped pass, and at the people who now finally feel seen." She concluded her segment with a simple yet powerful statement. Experience isn't about how long you've held power. It's about how well you've used it. The crowd responded not with roars, but with something deeper: respect. Some clapped slowly, others stood. There was no mistaking it. The balance of the room had shifted. What began as an attempt to embarrass Crockett had turned into a masterclass on how to challenge power without sacrificing grace. And Jasmine wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was giving voice to everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong at the table. And the panel wasn't over yet. As the panel drew to a close, it was clear that the evening had taken a turn no one expected. What began as an attempt to discredit Jasmine Crockett had transformed into a defining moment, one that left a permanent mark on everyone watching. Pam Bondi, once commanding the room, now sat diminished, her earlier remarks eclipsed by Crockett's eloquence and unshakable presence. Even the moderators hesitated, sensing the momentum had shifted entirely in Crockett's favor. But Crockett didn't gloat. Instead, she closed with humility and clarity. This isn't about personal attacks. It's about truth. And truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs to stand firm. The room erupted in applause, not out of spectacle but out of admiration. Crockett had turned an insult into an opportunity, and a smear into a spotlight. She didn't just defend her place on that stage, she redefined what it meant to earn it. In that moment, she wasn't just a congresswoman. She was a voice for the voiceless, a challenger of the status quo, and a leader who proved that dignity is more powerful than any attack. And as she walked off stage, heads turned, not in pity but in respect. Because she didn't just win the argument. She changed the conversation. The lights were bright, the cameras live, and the nation was watching, waiting for sparks to fly. It wasn't just another panel on judicial reform. It was a powder keg. On one end stood Pam Bondi, former Florida Attorney General, polished and prepared to dominate. On the other sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, underestimated by some, dismissed by others, but not by the truth she carried. The air buzzed with tension, the kind that makes even seasoned reporters grip their pens tighter. What followed wasn't a debate. It was a reckoning. And when Bondi tried to paint Crockett as unqualified, she didn't just ignite a conversation. She lit the fuse to something much bigger. What no one expected was that the woman they tried to corner would rise, not with rage, but with reason, with poise, and with power. And by the end of that night, it wouldn't be Bondi's accusations that echoed across the internet, but Crockett's clarity, her courage, and her call for justice. As the room slowly emptied and the last applause faded, one truth remained unshaken. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just answered an insult, she had reshaped the narrative. She didn't win the moment with fury or theatrics, but with clarity, conviction, and undeniable truth. In a political world where shouting often overshadows substance, she proved that grace can be louder than rage, and facts more powerful than fear. Her words didn't just silence a critic, they stirred a nation. Crockett walked off that stage not as a woman who defended herself, but as a leader who spoke for millions who've been silenced, doubted, or dismissed. Her story wasn't just political, it was personal, historical, and necessary. Because in that moment, when she stood calm and resolute against an orchestrated attack, she reminded America of the power of presence, the weight of dignity, and the unbreakable force of justice. And long after the headlines fade and the microphones go quiet, her voice, strong, measured, and unforgettable, will echo where it matters most. In the conscience of a nation still learning what leadership truly looks like.